This video is sponsored by the Wargames Research Group. I'm trying to build a complete compendium to teach new players how to play DBMM, so please like the video, comment and subscribe so this gets shown to more people. Today we're going to learn how combat resolution works in DBMM. DBMM is a wargame, so of course you're going to be doing lots of combat, so there's no better place to start. The first thing to understand is the game is divided into bounds, alternating between the player's bound and their opponent's bound, which represents the initiative of the battle, switching back and forth between the players. During each player's bound they move their forces and then combat takes place. The player active that bound decides the order the combats are fought, and units have special combat results depending on if it's their player's bound or their opponent's bound. There are 6 major factors that are likely to come up when determining the combat outcome. Those are the unit's base factor, support from your units, overlaps from the enemy units, the terrain the combat takes place in, if the unit fighting is a general, and finally the unit's grading. There are a few other niche factors that might influence the outcome, such as fighting at night or defending a fortification, but we'll cover those in other videos. These 6 will come up in nearly every game you play. We'll cover unit grading in a following video, as I want to discuss in depth how to value the different grades of superior, ordinary, inferior and fast, but we'll tackle the other 5 today. So to learn how combat works, let us head to one of the grudge matches of the ancient world, Rome versus Athens, to begin with the most simple form of combat. Every element has a type. Here we have a Roman legionary, which is the type blades, and we have an element of Greek peltas, which is the type auxilia. Elements have 2 combat factors depending upon their opponent's type. One combat factor used for fighting mounted troops, that includes everything you would expect, cavalry, knights, light horse as well as elephants. And one combat factor for everything else, listed as other. This includes all foot elements, all naval elements, and also all train elements, which includes things such as artillery pieces and baggage. Blades and auxilia are both foot troops, so they use the second combat factor. It's the Roman player's turn and he moves the blade into contact with the auxilia. Once all the movement is complete, as well as any shooting, it's time for combat. In this simple combat between 2 elements, there are no supports, overlaps or terrain to be taken into account, so both sides simply roll 1 dice and compare results. There is no complicated process of hit, wound, save as there are in other systems in DBMM, just a single opposed dice roll. There are 3 possible outcomes for combat. First, after all the factors are adjusted, a player can draw. Here our blades have a base combat value of 4 against foot troops, and has rolled a 2, giving him a combat score of 6. The auxiliary element has a base combat factor of 3 against foot, and its controller has rolled a 3, also giving them a total combat of 6. In the vast majority of cases, when a draw is reached, both sides remain locked in combat and there are no effects. These elements will continue to fight in the next player's bound. This is commonly called a stand result in the community. The second outcome is one side beating the other, but not doubling the result. In this example, the blade player has rolled a 4, which when added to their base combat value of 4, gives a final result of an 8. The auxiliary player has rolled a 2, which when added to their base combat value of 3, gives a final result of 5. The blade player has thus beaten their opponent, but has not doubled their result. This usually results in a pushback. In this case, the auxiliary element is pushed back its base depth. Depending upon the unit type, the winning player may be required to follow up, be unable to follow up, or have their choice whether they wish to do so or not. This will be covered in a later video. In this case, regular blades may choose whether to follow the defeated opponent, and the controlling player chooses to do so, moving them into combat again for the following bound. The third outcome is when one side's combat result is double or more than the other side's combat result. Here the blade has rolled a 6, added to their combat factor of 4, the final result is 10. The auxilia has rolled a 2, which when added to their base factor of 3 gives a total of 5. Because 10 is double or more than 5, in this case exactly double, we say the blades have doubled their opponent and the element is removed. When a base is removed in this way, the same follow-up rules apply. In this case, the Roman player chooses to remain still. If we were to reverse the results and the auxiliary player rolled a 6, their total combat score would be 9, while even if the blades had rolled a 1, their final combat outcome would have been a 5. Thus the auxiliary cannot double and destroy the blades in single element combat. This shows just how important one additional starting factor is when comparing unit types. So how can we alter combat factors to put the combat in our favour? The first option is supporting elements. In this example, the Greek player's auxilia has been replaced by 2 of that iconic unit of classical Greece, the Hoplite, which is a unit type of spear. Having a supporting element in the direct rear of a fighting element allows it to provide support to that element in certain circumstances. Whether an element can provide support to another element depends on 3 things: their types, the type of the unit they are fighting, and if it's the player or the opponent's bound. For example, when it's the opponent's bound and the spears are on the defensive, they lose the ability to support against light infantry elements such as auxilia, but gain the ability to support against shock cavalry such as knights, presenting a tightly pressed defensive shield wall. This system of when supports can and can't be given is what really provides some of that historical flavour to the combats. Blades, on the other hand, do not receive support and either bound against spears, so having a second base of blades behind the first provides no immediate combat bonuses. Here, both the blades and the spears have a base combat factor of 4, but thanks to the rear rank of spears, that is increased by 1 to 5. Both players roll a 3, giving the Hoplites a total of 8, and the Roman players a total of 7, pushing back the blades with the spears advancing. The next important way of altering the combat factors in your favour is overlaps. Overlaps represent the importance of maintaining a disciplined and coherent battle line in ancient and medieval warfare. Overlaps can be achieved in 2 ways. Firstly, every enemy in corner-to-corner contact with an element that is not itself fighting reduces that element's combat factor by 1. So in this example, the blade's combat factor is reduced from 4 down to 2 by the pair of uncontacted opposing elements on each corner. The second type of overlap is when part of an opposing element's side edge is in contact with your element's side edge, even if that unit is in combat. Now let's switch to a more realistic example where 3 spear elements with supports have contacted 3 blade elements. The player whose bound it is, in this case the player controlling the Greek spears, decides the order of the combats. He starts with the left-hand combat first. A pair of 2s are rolled, but thanks to the rear support of the spears have a final result of 7 to the blade's 6, pushing back the blades with the spears advancing. The spear player now has a choice to make, and decides to try and push his advantage. Selecting the right-hand combat, he rolls again, giving the final result of 9 to the spears, 6 to the blades. Not double, but enough to push them back again. Now here in the middle we have the spears on a base factor of 4, plus 1 for their support to 5. However, the opposing blades are now double overlapped by the spears that have advanced, so their base edges are touching the blade's edge, each base reducing their initial combat factor by 1, meaning the blades go from starting the dice roll on a 4 to starting the dice roll on a 2. The system of overlaps means DBMM has a push your luck element. You want to try and have a wider formation than your opponent to receive overlaps on the ends of the combat, and the player who's selecting the combat order needs to decide if they want to risk trying to achieve a double overlap situation, which can then easily destroy the opposing trapped element. This can be risky because if they had failed and the blade had destroyed the spear unit, then in the next combat both bases would be overlapped and fighting at reduced effectiveness. The 2 other types of overlaps to be aware of are ones in which a unit moves in from the side to make full base contact with their opponent. They must start beyond the edge of the opponent's flank, and there must be no enemies within the threat zone. More on these later. If this is the case and they have the movement to do so, they can make contact like this. This is what is called being hard flanked in the community. Still confers the -1 to the opposing element, but if a unit that is hard flanked loses the combat, even by just a factor of 1, they are destroyed. Similarly, in circumstances where a unit is hit in the rear, the same rule applies, and the attacking player only needs to win by 1 to destroy their opponent. However, not only does it confer a -1 for hitting their opponent in the rear, because the unit cannot recoil, it inflicts an additional -1. This occurs in all cases where a unit can't recoil, for example when fighting against the edge of a board, or in strange circumstances where enemy and friendly units cannot be pushed out of the way. The final thing to note on overlaps is that any non-skirmisher troop fighting with its flank on the edge of the board, such that another unit cannot overlap them, always receives a -1 as if they had been overlapped. This is to stop players from hugging the edge of the board in order to stop their units being surrounded. The 4th factor that can affect combat results is the terrain. Terrain's effect on combat is fairly simple. Terrain comes in 3 types: good going, rough going, and difficult going in order of extremity. How units are affected by terrain is dependent on their type. In general, mounted troops and close order infantry like spears and pike blocks do worse outside of good going terrain. There are broad categories for units and how terrain affects them that I've colour coded here. Troops in red fight with a -2 in difficult going and a -1 in rough going. Troops in amber fight with a -1 in difficult going and are unaffected by rough going. Troops in green fight at full effectiveness in any terrain type. Another important note is that no unit can provide support if either the front or supporting bases are in difficult going. If a base is even 1 mm within a piece of rough or difficult going, then that element receives the negative penalties of that terrain type. This wide coursing river is difficult going for all the units we have seen so far. The auxilia here is unaffected by any form of terrain and fights with its full factor of 3. The Roman blades receive a -1 to their combat factor, reducing them from a 4 to a 3. The spears are the worst affected, reduced from a factor of 4 to a 2 for being in difficult terrain and not receiving the rear ranking support. The final factor to know that regularly comes up is if a base is a general's element. Here we have a Roman general, which is the type cavalry, and 2 other cavalry units. It is usually a good idea to represent a unit is a general in some way you and your opponents can identify. In this case, I've given the general a purple cloak. Cavalry fight with a base combat factor of 4 against foot troops. Spears do not receive a supporting rank against cavalry. A general's unit of any type always gains an additional factor of +1, and thus this unit has a base combat factor of 5. Here the Roman generals rolled a 6 and the spears a 1, resulting in a final combat result of 11 for the Roman general and 5 for the spears, destroying it. Cavalry can choose to advance, and a Roman player wisely chooses not to, not wishing to be overlapped if he happens to draw the other combats. When a general's element kills an opponent, any element in base contact with the general is inspired by their general's bravery and receives a +1 to their combat rolls as well. Here both cavalry elements fight with a +1 for a factor of 5, and because the general's element is no longer engaged, it can provide corner overlaps for each combat, reducing the spears to 3, allowing for easy victories for both units. Generals can be incredibly deadly in combat and can be used to cut great chunks out of an opponent's army with their +1 inspired bonus on each flank. However, command and control becomes more difficult when the general is in combat, and losing a general can be a huge morale hit to an army, so using the general in combat is a risk-reward mechanic that will depend on the situation, the structure of the army, and the opponent you are facing. So that's the basics covered. Roll a single dice, add the base factor, plus supports, subtract overlaps and terrain effects. Try to deploy your force wide enough so that they can overlap the enemy without being so thin that holes occur in the line if you lose an element. Try to force your opponent onto ground that is unfavourable to them if you can, and select combats on your turn to increase the chance of overlaps. Always be on the lookout for the chance to double your opponent or lock his elements in hard flanks. Next week we'll be looking at the unique combat outcomes that break this draw-win double formula I've laid out in this introductory video, and which gives DBMM another huge dose of its historical flavour and tactical depth, so be sure to check back in next Thursday for that video. In the meantime, please like, comment and share the video so it can reach more people.